Hi everybody, I am Dr. Flux, and welcome back to our class in general psychology. I hope you're feeling curious and ready to dive into the intricate wiring that makes you, well, you. Neurons and synapses, the microscopic messengers responsible for everything from the thoughts that shape your reality to that split-second cringe when you remembered an awkward moment from years ago. But first, a little time travel. Let's rewind to our last lecture. You remember that we talked about how behaviors can be shaped through learning, whether it's Pavlov's dogs drooling over a metronome or getting shot with an airsoft gun every time you hear a "that was easy" button. Let's do a quick check-in. Which of the following best describes classical conditioning? A. Learning through rewards and punishments. B. Learning through observing others. C. Learning through association between two stimuli. Or D. Learning by trial and error. If you chose C, you're absolutely correct. Classical conditioning is about learning through association. Operant conditioning uses rewards and punishments. Let's do another one. Which of the following is an example of positive reinforcement? A. Taking aspirin to relieve a headache. B. Giving a child candy for doing their homework. C. Assigning extra chores after misbehavior. Or D. Ignoring a bad behavior to reduce it. The correct answer here is B. Children like candy, and so giving a child candy would be a positive reinforcer for doing something that you'd like them to continue. All right, now that we're warmed up, let's talk about today's journey. We're zooming in on the tiniest architects of your experience, neurons. These little cells don't just sit around passively, they fire with the energy that lets you read, run, dance, or even just wonder why you walked into a room and forgot what you needed. We'll explore their structure, how they transmit signals electrically, and how they talk to each other across tiny gaps called synapses using chemical messengers. We'll then dive into some of the different signals those chemical messengers can communicate before wrapping up with our conclusion and review. Here's the big question we'll explore today. How do neurons create thoughts, feelings, and behavior? I mean, think about it. Right now, billions of neurons are firing in your brain just to make sense of my voice. They're coordinating your thoughts, maybe even making you wonder if you had enough coffee today. But here's the kicker. They're doing all of this using the same basic process as when you first learned to walk or felt that spark of excitement meeting someone new. You might think neurons are super fast because you can pull your hand back from a hot stove in an instant. But neurons are actually pretty slow compared to fiber optic cables or even your old school telephone lines. Your brain is more like a series of relay runners, passing a baton than a smooth electric current zipping through a wire. That information on neurons travels at just 1 to 120 meters per second. Let's do a quick attention check. Which of these communicates fastest? A. Neurons. B. Fiber optic cables. C. Telephone line cables. Or D. Maybe smoke signals. The answer here is B. Fiber optic cables communicate at the speed of light, or about 300 million meters per second. Neurons are slower than snails by comparison, so here's something to ponder. When have your neurons saved the day? Maybe you caught a falling glass before it shattered, or you dodged a surprise snowball aimed right at your face. What we'll see today is how those instant reactions happen, thanks to the remarkable, if surprisingly slow, work of neurons and synapses. All right, let's crack open the vault and look at these incredible cells. First stop, neuron anatomy. Let's meet the players that make up the very foundation of your thoughts. Today, we're getting up close and personal with the neuron. Think of it like the celebrity of your nervous system. Sure, there are other cells that are important players, but neurons, they're the rock stars, sending messages, lighting up your brain, and making sure you don't forget where you left your keys. Most of the time. Let's break it down. Here's a cartoon neuron that I've put together. It looks a bit like a hesitant, oddly shaped tree, but instead of leaves, it's buzzing with electrical energy and chemical signals. So here's the tour. We start with the soma. This is the beating heart or brain of the neuron, also known as the cell body. It's home to the nucleus, where your neuron's genetic instructions are stored. Think of it as the neuron HQ, handling the day-to-day operations and making sure everything runs smoothly. Next, we've got the dendrites. These branch out from the soma. They're kind of like the tree's leaves and branches, but instead of soaking up sunlight, they're receiving signals from other neurons. They're like tiny antennae, always tuned in, waiting for the next message. Now, the axon, coming out of the cell body, is the neuron's superhighway. It's a long tail that carries messages away from the soma. But before any message can hit the road, it starts at the axon hillock. This is the neuron's decision-making hub. It's where it sums up and integrates all of the incoming signals and decides, is it worth continuing the message? If yes, it hits the gas and an electrical signal zooms down the axon. To keep things speedy, cells like oligodendrocytes in the brain and Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system create a myelin sheath. It's like putting insulation on electrical wires, making sure the signal doesn't get lost along the way. But it's not a continuous wrap. There are these little gaps called nodes of Ranvier, where the signal jumps from node to node, speeding up the process. At the end of the axon, we've got the axon terminal and terminal buttons. These are like the neuron's send button. Once the message reaches here, it's ready to be passed along to the next neuron in line through a little space called the synapse. But more on that later. Now, while this cartoon is how we often think about neurons, they actually come in all shapes and sizes. Some are tiny, just a few millimeters long, but others, they run the entire length of the body. From your spinal cord down to your toes, they can stretch to over 3 feet. That's like having a single cell that's taller than a toddler. Let's do another attention check. Which part of the neuron contains its genetic code? A, the axon, B, the axon hillock, C, the dendrites, or D, soma? Correct answer here is D, the soma. Think about it like the neuron's brain inside of your brain. All right, now that we've met the cast of characters, the soma, dendrites, axon, and friends, it's time to see them in action. Literally. Because today we're talking about action potentials, the electrical sparks that drive every thought, movement, and feeling you've ever had. An action potential is like the neuron's way of saying, hey, we've got something important here. It's an electrical impulse that zips down the axon, carrying a message from one end of the neuron to the other. But here's the wild part. It's an all-or-nothing signal. Either the neuron fires or it doesn't. There's no halfway, no kind of firing. It's like flipping a light switch on or off. It's called the all-or-none principle. Now let's talk about this using an analogy, which is beautifully demonstrated by the work of YouTuber Hevish5. This video has 15,000 dominoes carefully arranged to form an intricate pattern. Now when Hevish5 taps the first domino, click, 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 the whole thing comes to life in a beautiful cascading chain reaction. But here's the thing. The dominoes themselves aren't traveling down the line. They fall in place, transferring energy to the next one. That's exactly how an action potential works. The ions that cause the electrical charge don't physically move down the neuron. It's the electrical charge that moves, kind of like the momentum through those falling dominoes. So how do we get from resting to firing? Let's take a look. At rest, your neuron's electrical charge is chilling at negative 70 millivolts. That's its resting potential. When enough signals come in and bump that charge up to negative 55 millivolts, we've hit the threshold. This is that all-or-none principle. It's like the nudge that hits that first domino, and this is the point of no return. This triggers something called depolarization. Sodium ions, or Na+, flood into the neuron, flipping the charge from negative to positive. It's like dominoes toppling one after the other. Now this spark travels down the neuron, jumping from node to node in a process called saltatory conduction. After this, repolarization kicks in. Potassium ions, or K+, rush out, restoring the negative charge, kind of like resetting the dominoes for the next show. And this is where we get to the refractory period, because it takes some time to reset the system. Now, probably not as long as it takes to reset 15,000 dominoes, but we still get a bit of a lag. At this time, the neuron resets and it can't fire right away. Next up, let's take a look at the next step in this process, when electrical signals transform into chemical ones. We'll be taking a look at that synapse. But before we do, let's do another attention check. What is the resting potential of a neuron? Is it A, positive 40 millivolts, B, negative 55 millivolts, C, negative 70 millivolts, or D, 0 millivolts. The correct answer here is C. The resting potential of a neuron is negative 70 millivolts. So we've got our electrical signals firing down the neuron, but what happens when that signal reaches the end? How does it jump from one neuron to the next? Well, that's where things get interesting. Let's dive into the world of synapses. So zooming in on this little gap right here, we see the axon terminal button in purple and the dendrite that it's communicating with in blue. This encompasses the synapse. On one side is the presynaptic neuron, which is communicating with the postsynaptic neuron. The message has to jump this gap known as the synaptic cleft. It makes this jump not with electricity, but with chemicals called neurotransmitters, held in small containers known as vesicles. Think of it like this. The action potential gets the momentum going, but the neurotransmitters are the ones that hand off the message. They're like the relay signal being passed between two runners in a relay race. Once they get handed off, they signal to neurotransmitter receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. So what's the order of operations here? The electrical signal, or the action potential, travels down the axon and reaches the axon terminal. When it gets there, these tiny bubbles, the vesicles, release neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft, that little gap between neurons. The neurotransmitters then drift across the cleft and bind to receptors on the next neuron, like keys fitting into locks. Now, depending on the neurotransmitter that's released, this signal can either excite the next neuron, telling it that it should fire, or inhibit it, telling it to hold back. Once the message is delivered, the neurotransmitters don't just hang around. They get cleaned up through a process called reuptake. This includes reabsorption back into the presynaptic neuron for recycling, or sometimes being broken down by enzymes. Let's talk a little bit more about these different signals, using a familiar analogy, because excitation and inhibition is what runs the entire brain. When you hit the slopes to go skiing or snowboarding, there's often signs telling you whether a slope is opened or whether skiing down another slope might be a good idea. This communication either encourages you to keep going or warns you to rethink your choices. These are similar messages to the ones that some of our primary neurotransmitters in your brain communicate. Glutamate is like that open sign. It is the excitatory neurotransmitter of your brain. It encourages continuation of a signal. Neurons that release glutamate make it more likely that the next neuron will fire. Those warning signs, on the other hand, that's like the neurotransmitter GABA, or gamma-aminobutyric acid. GABA neurons issue a message that decreases the likelihood that a postsynaptic neuron will fire. It's a message to slow down and maybe rethink that enthusiasm. But here's the thing. Your brain isn't just sending one signal at a time. It's a constant tug of war between excitation and inhibition. And that balance is what keeps you functioning smoothly. Too much of either and things can get a bit messy. It's kind of like a seesaw. On one side, you've got excitation, neurons firing away. On the other side, you've got inhibition, keeping things calm, grounded, and under control. The brain is constantly balancing these forces, and that balance is what keeps you from feeling either overwhelmed or checked out. Let's sum it up. Excitatory neurotransmitters like glutamate make neurons more likely to fire. They're the let's go signal in your brain, pushing neurons towards that firing threshold. Inhibitory neurotransmitters like GABA do the opposite. They make neurons less likely to fire, acting as the brakes when things start moving too fast. But the cool part is that neurons don't just get one signal at a time. They're constantly receiving both excitatory and inhibitory inputs, and they sum them up. If the total sum pushes the neuron's membrane potential past the threshold, then bam, an action potential fires. If not, the neuron stays quiet. Let's do another attention check. Which of the following is an excitatory neurotransmitter? Is it A, GABA, B, serotonin, C, glutamate, or D, dopamine? The correct answer here would be C, glutamate. It's the driving force of much of the activity in your brain. What happens when this balance of inhibition and excitation gets thrown off? It can have some serious consequences. For example, too much excitation can lead to conditions like epilepsy, where neurons fire uncontrollably, causing seizures. On the other hand, too much inhibition can contribute to depression, where neural activity slows down, leading to low energy and motivation. It's a little more complex than that, but this is a good rule of thumb for understanding these things. Your brain is like a finely tuned machine, constantly adjusting to keep the balance just right. We've taken a deep dive into the world of neurons today. We've seen how these tiny cells, through electrical sparks and chemical conversations, form the foundation of everything you experience, from the moment you wake up in the morning to that last thought before you fall asleep at night. And they keep going all through the night and until the next day. So let's recap. Neurons are the fundamental building blocks of your nervous system. They send messages using electrical impulses and chemical neurotransmitters. Those messages, they come in the form of action potentials, which fire only when the neuron's threshold is reached. No halfway sparks. It's all or nothing. At the synapse, neurotransmitters like glutamate and GABA either encourage the next neuron to fire or tell it to hold back. And perhaps most importantly, the balance between excitation and inhibition is what keeps your brain running smoothly. It's the reason you can shift from focus to relaxation, from high energy moments to quiet reflection. But neurons aren't just about transmitting signals. They're about creating you. Every memory you have, every emotion you felt, every move you've made, it all started with neurons firing in harmony. When you learned to ride a bike, when you felt your heart race during a hike, when you had that aha moment solving a problem, all of that was your neurons doing their incredible work. Before we wrap up, here's a couple of review questions to take a look at what we've learned today. Which part of the neuron receives signals from other neurons? Is it A, the axon, B, the axon hillock, C, the dendrites, or D, the soma? The answer here is C, dendrites. They relay messages from other neurons to the soma. How do neurotransmitters like glutamate and GABA affect the postsynaptic neuron? A, both neurotransmitters inhibit neuron firing. B, glutamate excites, GABA inhibits. C, both neurotransmitters excite neuron firing. Or D, GABA excites and glutamate inhibits. The answer here is, of course, B. Glutamate is excitatory, while GABA is inhibitory. Remember, every thought you have, every feeling you experience, every move you make is powered by the incredible network of neurons firing inside your brain. The more we understand them, the more we understand ourselves. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next lecture, where we'll dive even deeper into how the nervous system shapes who we are. So thanks for joining me on this neural adventure today. Until next time, stay curious, stay resilient, and above all, live life in flux. I'll see you in the next lecture.